Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me for this session today. We all need to learn about grant writing skills, right? And this is a really important one. So we're going to be talking about piquing the interest of funders through persuasive proposal writing. Grant writing is all about getting the money. It's all about getting the money. Having good writing skills is half the battle. But there's the other half of the battle, and that other half of the battle is writing it in a way that's going to be persuasive. I'll talk so much today about what exactly that means and how do you do it. So thanks for joining me today. Here we go. Let me tell you a little bit about myself, kind of why I'm here talking to you about this particular topic. So my name is Andrea Hoff. I am the owner and president of a company called You Thrive Training and Consulting. My background is really in behavioral health. I've been doing that work for almost 27 years. Like most of you out there, I'm sure I started in the nonprofit world, and in nonprofits, we need money. So I learned how to grant write and I fell in love with it. I've been doing that for, goodness, probably 23 of those 27 years. And just really immersed myself in it. So in addition to being a grant seeker for 23 years, I've also spent about 13 years actually working on the other side of things as a grant maker or as a funder. And a lot of the things that I will share with you today kind of comes from my perspective in that area. I'm what's called a grant professional certified, or a GPC. It's one of those, horrendous 6-hour standardized exams that you take and then just pray that you passed. So yeah, I've been a GPC for quite a while now. I'm the immediate past president of the Miami Valley, Ohio chapter of the Grant Professionals Association, member of the Ohio Association of Fundraising Professionals. I'm very happy to be able to say that I've raised over $31 million in the last 2 years since I've started my company with You Thrive. And I have about $13 million in grants that is pending right now. So we're all on pins and needles right now for about the next 4 or 5 months before we find out the awards for all of those. Happy to be here. Training people about grants is one of my absolute favorite things to do. So yeah, we're going to be talking about your writing skills. And just know that there are several different types of writing. Again, having a good writing skill, just having that in your tool belt is a really good place to start. But it is only one place to start, because you can be a good writer in one area, and that's not necessarily going to translate very successfully into grant writing. So that's what I want to talk about today. And you can see the really kind of standard 4 different types of writing here on the screen before you. I tell you, I taught a grant writing course at the university level for several years. And I learned very, very quickly that my students were wonderful at this very first one. That's expository writing, right? That explains a concept. It doesn't include the author's opinion, right? Because it's all about facts. So think about textbooks, think about how-to articles, think about research papers or recipes, right? It's not about opinion, it's about fact. And my students were great at doing that because they spent their entire college careers writing research papers. It was really about teaching them how to translate all of those good writing skills around research papers and turning that into grant writing skills. But there's other types of writing. When you think of descriptive writing, when you think of narrative writing, those tell a story, they paint a picture. Think about all those wonderful fiction and nonfiction books that we read for fun. Those are really great, but none of those are what's going to get us the money, right? What gets us the money is what's called persuasive writing. And you can see here, we are trying to convince the reader of something. We're taking a position, we're taking a stance. We are convincing them that we are the best program, the best individual, the best organization to fund for whatever it is that we are applying for. That's called persuasive writing. Yes, absolutely. It contains our opinions as the author, our ideas. Absolutely. It has to, as we are convincing them why we are the most credible, the best option for them to fund compared to the other 5, 20, 200 other applications that they may have received, right? So under persuasive writing, you can see other examples: cover letters, op-eds. Definitely our grant proposals fit under this category. So think about what exactly does this mean to be persuasive? So let's just break that down. When we think about the word persuasion, what we really are trying to do is to influence someone, right? And not just influence the way they think, the way they feel, but we want to influence their behavior. You see some really standard definitions of the word persuasion here when you think of things like to cause someone to believe something, especially after a sustained effort to convince them, to cause them to do something through reasoning or argument, right? Or of a situation or event to provide a sound reason for someone to do something. All of those things really go together because we have to convince someone, we have to change their thinking that this is the right way to go, that this is the right thing to do, that we are the right person, organization, project to fund. We have to change their thinking. Once we change their thinking, then we also change the way that they believe. So they go from cognitively thinking this is the right thing to do to feeling it, going, yeah, this is where we want to put our money. Again, comparatively to all of the other applications that they've read. When we change the way they think, that we change the way they feel, then we can change behavior. And that behavior is them writing us the check and not somebody else. At the end of the day, persuasion is all about this, right? It's the art of getting what we want. And I mean, goodness, while that might sound self-serving, it's not when you think about grant proposals, because all of those grant dollars are going to reach all those amazing, wonderful organizational missions that you guys all have out there. So the bottom line to this is, if it's the art of getting what we want, how do we get what we want? What do we do? What are those really tangible, kind of practical things that we can do within our grant proposals that's going to be persuasive, that's going to change their thinking, their feeling, their behaviors, so that we gain more grant dollars, grant awards. That's what we're going to talk about. There really is a couple of ways to do that. Okay, we're going to talk about two very specific ways today. One, it is all about thinking through the eyes of someone else. It is thinking through the eyes of the funder. If we're going to persuade the funder, we have to know a little bit about what they're thinking. The second thing we will talk about is thinking through the eyes of the grant reviewer. Okay. Now, those two might seem a little repetitive, and sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't, knowing that every grant process is a little bit different. So I know I told you I spent 13 years serving as a funder. During those 13 years, I certainly spent time where I, as the funder, was also the grant reviewer. That happens all the time in grant processes. But I also spent time where I, the funder, was not the grant reviewer. We brought in volunteer community members. We brought in subject matter experts. We brought in other people to serve as that grant reviewer. So they can absolutely be two different thinking processes, and we have to think through the eyes of both. At the end of the day, though, regardless of who's sitting at that table doing that, this first one, thinking through the eyes of the funder, is thinking through their funding processes, their priorities, their experiences, their perspectives. We'll talk all about that. The second one is all about that actual review process. When whoever it is, the reviewer, whether that's the funder or community volunteer, that actual process of them sitting down with your proposal in their hands, and 20 others in their hands, the actual process and how we can think through their eyes to make our proposals more persuasive. Okay, so those are the two areas we're going to talk about. We're going to start with the very first one. So how can we think through the eyes of the funder? And we're going to start this by looking at a model called the persuasion intersection. Now, let me call out a source here, okay? Just know that this comes from a book by very prolific authors by the name of Miner and Miner. I say prolific because they have just written a ton of textbooks in the grant writing field. I use several of their textbooks when I was teaching at the university level because I love them. Very, very hands-on, very tangible, practical ways that we can improve our grant writing skills. So what minor and minor goes on to say is that there really are 4 different ways in which we can think through the eyes of the funder so that our proposals can be much more persuasive. I would say that none of these individually are rocket science, but they do certainly help us to think through very intentionally. How can we integrate? How can we weave language into our proposals that's going to help us to reach each of these different components that are going to add persuasion to our writing? So you see the 4 here. We're going to talk about funder values, proposal logics, proposal psychologics. We'll talk about what does that mean, because that could be a new word for many of us. And then applicant credibility. We will talk about each of those individually and how we add persuasion into our grant applications. So let's start with the very first one, and that is funder values, thinking through the eyes of the funder. Okay, so we have to acknowledge that funders have a really unique perspective, a unique view of the world, about social issues, about things that they really care about, things that they wish to improve, community issues, injustices, inequities, things like that, that they really are so committed to that they're committed funding to them. Right. And so in thinking through their experiences, their perspectives, their priorities, there's just so much learning for us as to how we can adhere our proposal language to them. But just know that every funder is very different in their view of the world and what they value, because funders are human too. We know that, right? Funders are human too. And that means they've all had their own upbringings, their set of values, their belief sets, their integrities, that the things that they really sit in their time and space within their world. Their experiences could be different than our experiences. Their experiences create their perspectives on the world. Those perspectives might be different than our perspectives. All of those things, their experiences and their perspectives, turn into their priorities, their funding priorities. Okay, it becomes our job then to translate their views so that we can adapt each of our individual proposals to each of the individual and unique views of each distinct funder. Okay, gone are the days 20 plus years ago of copying and pasting a single grant proposal for 5 different funders. We can't do that because each of them have different views of the world and different values. Now, that's true, particularly if we are talking about, let's look at it through this lens, a private family foundation, okay? Private, wealthy families that have a large endowment that they invest and then they turn it into an asset that they have the ability to grant out into some sort of granting process, driven by a single family's perspectives, experiences, oftentimes established out of personal experiences. So if I'm a wealthy family and I've experienced cancer from a family member, might I want to put my granting money into something to support families going through cancer situations, right? If I grew up in childhood poverty and worked my way out of that, and now I am a wealthy family putting my money towards something, would I not want to put it towards childhood poverty? Their experiences, their perspectives, right? That could be even different than, say, I'm a government funder, okay, where I have heightened scrutiny because I am responsible for being good fiscal stewards of taxpayer dollars. And I have to think through that lens with everything that I do in my granting process. That is a very different lens than the lens I just described with a private family foundation. So we can certainly look through, is this a corporate funder? Is it a private family funder? Is it a public community funder? Is it a government funder? And if it is a government funder, at what level? Is it at a very local level that could really understand more grassroots stuff? Is it a state government? Is it federal government? So many things that we can tease out to learn about that funder that's going to give us insight to it. While at the same time, please know that just because you have one, for example, private family foundation, we can't say every private family foundation is going to have the same experiences, perspectives, and priorities than another private family foundation. So we even have to tease it apart even more than that. Okay, and identifying what their experiences, their perspectives, their priorities are. So how do we do that? Okay, it really is, it's all about thinking about their view of the world and where are they coming from. Okay, we know that every funder, as they are determining, they have this pot of money and they're figuring out what are we going to do with it? What are we going to prioritize this year? Because by the way, oftentimes funders' priorities will change from year to year to year. So another word of caution, just because we've understood their priorities in past funding years doesn't mean that it's going to be the same priorities moving forward. That definitely evolves over time. So yeah, they have this situation in the world, their view of the world, where there is a gap between a current situation and an improved situation. What is and what should be. What is currently happening and the status of how they think it ought to be within that particular community or with that particular target population. That gap right there, that's their values, right? Their mission by funding these dollars out is to close that gap, to close the gap between the current situation and the improved situation within that particular community or target population or whatever the case may be. Then it becomes our job to figure out what are their ideas for closing that gap and then aligning our ideas with their ideas, because that will be persuasive, right? Now, the truth is that so many of the social services, the human services that we all have wonderful organizational missions on that we are seeking grants for, we have different perspectives than they do. And they're so complex that there may be lots and lots and lots of different ways to close that gap. So let me just give you a quick example. Let's take the huge issue of childhood poverty, because you can ask 50 different people, what's the best solution to childhood poverty? And you're going to get 50 different answers. If I go into this process and I say, well, no, what I think we should do about childhood poverty is, my organization that's applying for this funding is we need to do more employability with skills with parents. We need to get them jobs, help them to learn how to do that and to become financially secure. Well, if that's not what the funder values, maybe they are valuing just safety net services. Like we have children living in poverty. They need roofs over their head. They need food in their bellies. They need safe neighborhoods to live in, safety net services. If I apply to that funder about employability, when their value system is safety net services, that's not persuasive. It's not going to get funded. Here's another example. I could say kindergarten readiness, right? Let's break the generational poverty, the generational cycle of poverty. Let's break that and teach our young people how to be academically ready at a very young age. And that's my value as the organization that's applying. When the funder says, no, what we really need to do is more childcare subsidies. Let's get parents access to childcare so that they can go to work. You understand where I'm going with this. You see where it can lead to a disconnect, right? We have to align our values with their values, our ideas of closing the gap with their ideas of closing the gap. That becomes persuasive. So the question becomes, how do we do that? How do we know? How do we identify what the funder's values are? And the really simple answer to that is through what we call prospect research. Okay, so it's a branch of the grant writing field that is all about doing our homework on funders. And there's lots of different ways that we can go about doing that. We certainly can research their websites really thoroughly. There's a lot of learning that we can get just off by doing some great Googling. But know that not every single funder out there has a website. That's a very true statement, even though, we are in 2022. It's still a true statement, but that's a great place to start, right? Another great place to start would be pulling down what's called their IRS 990s, which is the tax form that they have to submit. That gives you great learning. It tells you who's on their board of directors. It tells you their staff. It tells you who they have funded in the past. It tells you the award amounts that they funded in the past. Great learning from pulling down their 990s. And you know what? The old school, calling them, having some conversations with them, meeting them for coffee, meeting them at their office, really starting to learn about them. I always say the very first several meetings with a new funder should not be about you making a request. It should just be about you asking good questions and learning about them. Through that process, you might find out that you have a great alignment with what they're doing. But you know what? If it's not an alignment, that's not wasted time. Wasted time is you spending time writing a grant proposal to a funder that's never going to get you an award. Okay, so doing our due diligence and really thinking through that funder's view of the world and how we align our values with theirs, how we close the gap the same way that they want the gap to be closed, that is persuasive. Okay. It's a lot of work, but it's a lot of good work that helps us to get grant awards at the end. That's the first one. That is all about funder values. The second one is what minor and minor call proposal logics. So proposal logics, I love the word logics in here because it really does talk about how there is a logical progression between the way that we write the grant, where we always say that there should be continuity or cohesiveness between the different parts of our grant application. So we have this proposed need in the community, and we all know that in our grant application, we have to write need statements. Sometimes they're called problem justification statements. But we have to identify that there's some sort of community need or some sort of need within a target population. And now we're tying that, there's a logical progression between what the need is to that gap that we just talked about. Remember, that gap is that solution, that project that's going to close that gap between the current situation and an improved situation. So logical progression from the need in the community to the solution, how we are closing that gap. But we don't stop there. What minor and minor says is there also has to be this logical connection, this logical progression between how we are closing that gap, those proposed solutions, to it equating, that solution equating to an improved situation. Remember the bridge with the gap in it. It went from what is to what ought to be, right? So that closing that gap needs to get to that other side of the bridge of that improved situation. You can think of those improved situations as those really specific measurable objectives that we all have to write into our grant applications, right? They are absolutely measurable. We're giving them goals, objectives, things like that, that we are telling them that if we provide this service, we close that gap, we can contribute to the solution, we're going to equate to an improved situation, those objectives. We're going to meet those objectives. But that doesn't stop there. There also still needs to be this logical progression, this connection from, okay, now I've improved this situation. Now what that equates to is benefits to the target population. That means we're going to achieve outcomes, okay, using the language that we all see within our grant applications and within those requests for proposals, those RFPs that funders release. They use a lot of that language. So you see, this is logical, those proposal logics. I love that minor and minor includes this in here because, again, from my perspective of having read hundreds of grant applications in my career, particularly working as a funder, I can read a proposal and see a complete disconnect from one to the other, a complete disconnect from the need statement to the solution, to the objectives, to the outcomes, and those just simply do not get funded. Okay, there has to be that cohesiveness, that logical progression and connection. What we're doing in this section, what is so important to funders, as we are defining the funder's return on investment, okay, what we call an ROI. That is a term that I did not see when I started in the field 20 some years ago. Didn't even know what that term meant back then. But my goodness, I see it all the time now and have really over the last decade or so. The funder is saying, if I give you this money, what's going to be my ROI? What is the return on that investment that I give to you? And when we can prove to a funder that there is a return on their investment, that we are giving them a solid ROI, that is persuasive. That is absolutely persuasive, okay? But it doesn't stop there. So that is the second one, right, of minor and minor's persuasion intersection. Here is our third one. I know this is a bit of a strange word, right? Psychologics. And quite honestly, I'm not sure that it's an actual word. I think it is something that maybe minor and minor came up with on their own, but I like it because it makes such good sense. What minor and minor is saying is that funders don't just make funding decisions, award decisions based on things that are logical. It also has to respond to the emotional needs of the funder. Remember, I said that funders are human too, and that doesn't mean, or that means it's not just about scoring rubrics, right? It's not just about mathematical equations, that we really have to tap into these psychological needs, hence psychologics. We have to tap into the psychological needs of our funders. And that means what they want to see in our grant proposals are things like what you see on the screen here: trust, energy, passion, ownership, commitment. I mean, my goodness, the truth is, we know that words are powerful. If you have ever read a book, whether it was for work, a professional book, or for personal reasons, if it was a fiction or nonfiction, and if you have ever been moved emotionally, you've ever laughed out loud, if you've ever been moved to tears, if you've ever been angry at a character, you understand how emotionally moving writing on a page can be to a person's psyche as they are reading that. And yes, while we are not writing, fictional novels with our grant proposals, we absolutely can exude an emotional response out of our readers. We absolutely can, by weaving in things like trust and energy and passion and ownership and commitment. But the question is how? How do we do that, right? We don't come out and just go, hey, our organization is trustworthy, please trust us. Or, hey, we have a lot of energy for this project. It's not that simple. It gets a little bit further into it. So we have to do things like ask ourselves, what can we learn from the funder that will help us to shape these psychological experiences? And again, kind of going back to what we just talked about doing all this prospect research and learning as much as we can about the funder doing all of our homework. We can look into things like, do they have a favorite organization that they fund? And if so, what makes them a favorite? I can certainly pull up a funder's last 7 years of IRS 990 forms and find out that they have funded the same organization for the last 7 years. Okay, that's a favorite organization. Now, what is it about that organization that makes them a favorite? And you know what? I'm networking. I'm calling that organization up and I'm getting to know them. I'm taking them out for coffee and I'm learning a little bit more about the relationship that they have with that particular funder. That's what we do in this field. On the other kind of shoe, have they defunded a particular service or changed their funding in a way to overcome some sort of obstacles in the past? So maybe they were not reaching the ROI that they were expecting to reach. Maybe the services that they were funding were not achieving those specific measurable objectives, those outcomes that they wanted to see, the benefits to the target population. We would want to know that, and we would want to know why. And goodness, so much goes a long way in having good dialogue, good conversations with our funders to learn this information. As we do our due diligence with this and we learn all of that information from funders, from organizations that they've funded in the past, then it's also just about looking at our own proposals very critically. How many of us do this? Go back and read a proposal that we've written and ask ourselves, what have I said in this proposal that really exudes trust and energy and passion and ownership and commitment? And doing some self-reflection and really being honest with ourselves. If we read it and we're like, wow, that was really boring. If it's a boring read, if it's putting us to sleep, it's not exuding those intangible elements that we really want to exude. Another great way, kind of litmus test for this, is to hand it off to somebody else. Maybe somebody who isn't as closely invested in it as we are ourselves, because we're the author of the writing. Hand it off to someone and tell them to, tear it up. Like, you're not going to hurt my feelings. I need you to be 100% perfectly honest with me. Do you read these intangible elements: trust, energy, passion, commitment, ownership? Do you? And if so, where? Another great way to see, are we having that same emotional response or not? Keeping in mind that information alone does not equal persuasion. Information: we will do this, we will do that, we will do this, we will do that. It will take this much time, it'll take this much money, it'll take this much staff. Information alone, information's great. We want to give our funders enough information, but then we have to explain how we can reach that emotional side of them. I will give some examples a little bit later on, okay? But let's move on to our fourth. Remember, the persuasion intersection has 4 different components, and this is our fourth one. It is applicant credibility. Okay, we have to prove that we are credible. Now, what exactly does that mean? And you can see that here on the slide. Credibility is just the quality of being believable. Believable, right? We want our funders to believe in us and worthy of trust. So this is going right back to those psychologics that we just talked about. Trust. Funders need to trust you. They do want to be good fiscal stewards of their dollars, and they're taking a risk. Every single time they write those dollars and send it off to an organization, they are taking a risk and wanting to know that that organization is going to be good fiscal stewards of those dollars, that they're going to manage them well, that they're going to do what they said they would do. And so we have to weave into our writing what we call credibility statements. Also know that there's 3 different levels in which we have to prove our credibility. So it's not enough to do just one. One, organizationally, okay? Yes, this is a specific project with an organization. Yes, it's maybe specific staff that are going to be managing it. But as an organization, are you a sound, secure organization? And how have you proven that? Have you proven that through achieving certain accreditations or licensures? Have you proven that by having longevity with your organization? You've been around for 50 years, or you've been successful at this particular service for 80 years, or whatever the case may be. And is that both from having really sound human resources processes within your organization, as well as really sound fiscal processes within your organization? How are you a sound organization, a credible organization? We drill down to that a little bit. We would say, and who are the individuals, and what are their credibility statements as well? Are we handing this off to people who know what they're doing? And how are you weaving that into your language? Okay. Easy credibility statements could be things like certifications or licensures showing that they are subject matter experts in the work that they are doing. Is it that they know how to manage projects? They have tons of years of experience in managing specific projects. If it's a child-focused program that they've spent, 20 years of their lives in child-focused programs, okay, is it about the amount of schooling that they've had? What is defining them as subject matter experts for the individual credibility statements? And then also the project. So the individual project that would be funded through this funding source, It's filtering down through your organization to the people who are managing it, down to the actual project. Has that project been around for a while? If it hasn't been around for a while, and certainly there are situations where that happens too, that also get funded. You think about pilot projects. Have you done your due diligence? Have you done your homework? Have you done your research to make sure that it's going to be a sound, solid, credible project based in things like best practices or utilizing what we call evidence-based programs or practices? How are you defining it as a credible project? So always remember that those credibility statements have to be on 3 different levels. Your job at the end of the day for this one is to prove that you have a credible organization proposing a credible idea to be directed by credible project staff. All 3 layers. So then the question to that is, well, how do we do that, right? And we're enhancing our credibility by establishing 2 things. One is our authority, and the other one is our uniqueness. So authority just means we are the experts at this. We are the authorities at this, and this is how we are proving it. Again, those examples I gave before, accreditations, maybe achievements, maybe recognitions, maybe awards that we've received, maybe articles that were in the newspaper about us in a really positive way. How are we an authority on this? Are there peer-reviewed journal articles that our staff have written for this, right? We are an authority. And then the second one is our uniqueness. This is particularly important if you are writing for a service that lots of other organizations provide, right? How do you stand out among the crowd? What is unique about your service that maybe another organization is not doing? Or how are you maybe reaching a segment of the population that other community organizations are not reaching, a certain geographic area, a certain demographic that has certain risk factors or are more vulnerable than maybe other populations being served by other organizations? All of that is going to define our uniqueness and is going to add to our credibility for the particular service that we are applying for. Now, I think because all of this goes back to this kind of psychological need that we are adhering to, really trying to tap into the emotional side of our funders, because by the way, we're talking about persuasion. I want to give a couple of examples. So here's one example. I know this is a very wordy slide. Let me just read it. That will make it easier. But as I'm reading it, I would like you to think about, what are you hearing that would give you a sense of trust, a sense of energy, a sense of passion, a sense of ownership, a sense of commitment? Okay, where do you hear this? So here we go. For more than a decade, project partners have collaborated on a variety of grant-related initiatives, including a 6-year joint teacher education program between the College of Native Americans and Midwestern Regional College. The project director has led several successful national intervention projects for Native American middle school students, including Kids Math Camp, Achievement in Math, and Math and Science Immersion. Each one of these projects has been sustained beyond the conclusion of its granting period through the generosity of individual philanthropy and in-kind contributions from partner institutions. There's a lot to take in. Let me pull out some of those pieces that I think really does tap into those emotional needs of our funders. So I've highlighted them here for you to see. For more than a decade, okay, that says to me longevity, it says sustainability, and to me, that says commitment, okay? It's not a fly-by-night project, right? How about this? A 6-year joint teacher education program. There's ownership in that. It's a joint teacher program. It's not one person trying to make a difference. It's all of us coming together collaboratively, and we have to all have ownership of that. Several successful national intervention projects. Wow, right? It is those wow statements that we're looking for. There's energy in there. There's passion in there. How about this one? Each one of these projects has been sustained beyond the conclusion of its granting period. Again, sustainability, longevity, commitment. And goodness, I could have highlighted this last part of the sentence too, right? The generosity of individual philanthropy and in-kind contribution from partner institutions. That says to me also commitment, like I'm not the only funder they're going after. Other people believe in this project. They believe in that project. So a quick example, just how you can see how we can weave in things that seem to be really intangible. Trust, energy, passion, ownership, commitment. Seems really intangible, and we're not doing it in just a way that sounds wonky, like, hey, you can trust us, right? Different ways to weave that in there. One more thing, I really want to talk about how we think through the funder's eyes before we move into thinking about the grant reviewer's eyes, is thinking about this fact that we should always be thinking about how is our writing, are we looking through the self perspective, or are we looking through funder oriented perspectives? Is this about our needs as a project or an organization? Or is it about the funder's needs, what they identify as a value, as a priority? I'll give you some examples because this is a huge issue within our granting community. Again, I've read so many applications where it was very self-oriented and not aligned with the funder's values and having this funder-oriented needs. So examples. Here's self-oriented needs, just a couple of examples, and then I'll compare them to funder-oriented needs to give you some examples of how it could be improved. The first one being, the Family Welfare Agency requests a grant of $25,000 to meet its operating expenses. Self-oriented, its own operating expenses, right? Self-oriented. Top Flight High School invites you to share in a $100,000 project to buy new computers. It's self-oriented. We need computers. Give us computers. How about this one? La Casa de Esperanza requests your support of $50,000 to hire a case manager. We need a case manager. Very self-oriented. Let's look at how we can turn this around to a funder-oriented needs, okay? What's going to speak to our funders? The first one, the Family Welfare Agency invites your investment of $25,000 to sustain the delivery of crucial services to victims of violence and abuse. That's funder-oriented, right? If we know that victims of violence and abuse is the value, the priority, the strategy that the funder is focusing on, that's about their needs, okay? It's not about ours. It's not self-oriented. The second one, Top Flight High School invites your participation in a $100,000 project to reduce student achievement gaps in science and mathematics. Reduce student achievement gaps. If that's the funder's priorities, the funder's values, that's how we orient it to their needs. And the last one, La Casa de Esperanza invites you to share in a $50,000 project to improve the quality of life for Hispanics with chronic health conditions. Improve the quality of life, right? Hopefully you can see the difference. I can only tell you from experience in reading one versus the other, how you get this immediate emotional, when you see the funder-oriented needs, this immediate emotional, like, yes, I want to fund this. And the opposite, when it's self-oriented, it's like, as a funder, I'm not in the business to just fund an organization and meet their needs. That's not what it's about. Okay. So there you go, folks. That is all about thinking through the eyes of the funder as they are determining what their priorities, their strategies are going to be for funding. But let's take this a little bit step further and also look at the grant reviewer's experience, the actual process of them reviewing your application. They have your application in hand, in addition to 5 others, 10 others, 20 others, whatever the case may be. And they have an experience that they're going through, okay? Now, if any of you have ever sat through this experience, if you've ever gone through this process, this is going to resonate with you because it is absolutely true, right? There's a lot of reading. I don't care if you're reading 5 proposals, if you're reading 30 proposals, after about the 3rd or 4th one, they all start to blend together. Because our brains can only hold so much. There's a lot of reading, okay? And that can be intense. There is the tedium of scoring rubrics, okay? Not every funding process has a scoring rubric, but for those that do, I've been in that situation where I have my scoring rubric on one screen of my computer and I have the proposal up on the other screen, and I'm doing this cross comparison. Did they meet this one? Did they not meet this one? Do I rate it a 4? Do I rate it a 5? And that's tedious. It is very, very tedious and can become exhausting, right? There's absolutely also this level of comparative analysis. So again, once you've gotten to your second one, your third one, your fourth one that you reviewed, now you're going, well, that one sounded better than the last one, or this one doesn't sound as good as the last 3. Should I go back and change the score of the scoring rubric of the other? So yeah, there is absolutely this comparative analysis. It's a competitive process. And grant reviewers want to do their due diligence with that and make really good decisions. But again, it can become pretty exhausting. We have those proposals that just don't adhere to the prescribed requirements. So yeah, maybe it's something as simple as they didn't use the right type of font, the right size of font, they didn't use 1-inch margins, but it could also be, we told them to respond to 5 different required activities and I can only find 4. Where's the 5th one? And so I'm flipping pages and I'm looking for it because I don't just want to miss it. That is really, really difficult and can make that experience hard. Then you have this, I just call it the huh moment, where I've read this sentence or this paragraph 5 times and I still have no idea what it's trying to say. And I really want to understand what it's trying to say so I know how to score it, or I know how to compare it to the other proposals that I'm reading. So I've read it 5 times and that gets tiring, right? And let's just face it, folks, not all of these are the most exciting topics in the world. Some of them are, some of them absolutely are, but not all of them, right? So all of that can become exhausting. I would like all of you, every single one of you, to remember this. As you are thinking through the grant reviewer's experience, you're putting on that lens. This is the reality that I want you to sometimes remember, right? Always remember what we call the grant reviewer's rule of 12. The rule of 12 is this: the grant reviewer just worked 12 hours. It is 12 o'clock midnight, and your proposal is the 12th one in the pile. What? I'm tired just thinking about that. I'm so tired just thinking about that, right? Because it is very true that many grant reviewers have full-time jobs, 40 hours a week, and then they are doing this in the evenings. That is absolutely a true statement. And so this is what ends up happening. Okay, through all of that I just described, we get these situations. Grant reviewers, they are tired. Their eyes hurt from staring at the screen. Their shoulders hurt from, leaning over their keyboard. They're thinking about the fact that they haven't eaten in 6 hours. And nowadays, now that things are so virtual, oftentimes some of this is happening in our home. So not necessarily in an office, in our homes with babies on our laps, with dogs barking to be let out, with our family wondering what's for dinner. And because we are so mobile, sometimes we're not even sitting at a desk, we're in our bed, we have papers everywhere. And this can be their experience, right? This brings me to what is called the stress response curve. Okay, old school. This was released in 1979, but it is still absolutely valid today. Valid in lots of our stress responses, but very much so in a grant reviewer's world as well, that when we have very little stress, if you look on the left-hand side of this diagram, very little stress, performance is down. That means we're bored. We're twiddling our thumbs. We don't want to do what we have to do because it's just not stimulating us intellectually in any way. As that stress level goes up, we get to what's called that comfort zone. That green area right there is our sweet spot, right? Not overly burdened with stress, not under aroused, not underperforming. And you see that performance goes up when we're in that sweet spot. But what happens when stress continues to go up and go up and go up and go up? Our performance starts to go down. So what, what in the world? Why is Andrea spending so much time talking about stress? We all understand stress. The fact is that our job as grant writers is to make our writing so easy to read, so refreshing for the grant reviewer, that they have this emotional response. Again, going back to they make emotional responses that goes, yes, we want to fund this because I didn't have to read a sentence 5 times to understand what it meant. I didn't have to look for that 5th required activity when I couldn't find the 5th one. They prescribed, they wrote to all the prescribed requirements. They did what they were supposed to do. And again, going back to my own experiences as a grant reviewer, I have read those that is like, a cool breeze on a summer morning as soon as you start reading it versus those that are really, really exhausting to get through. Okay, that's our job. So understanding the grant reviewer's experience, our job as grant writers to help their experience be as positive of one as we can. And here's the way that we're going to do that. Here's the how. Okay, first of all, it's all about enhancing what we call readability. Okay, readability is just that ease with which a reader can understand a written text. Okay, and there's a couple of things that goes into that. And you've all understood this. When you've read a book and you just breeze through it, you're like, oh, 5 minutes later and you've read 15 pages, as opposed to 5 minutes later and you've read 1 because you're so bored or it's so convoluted that you can't get through it, right? 2 different things that depends on: the content, and that's just the complexity of the vocabulary. And the second one is the typography, the font size, the line height, the line length. We're going to talk about both of those: the content, the complexity of the vocabulary, and typography. How can we make our grant proposals more highly readable? That's what that's all about. So let's talk about complexity of vocabulary. First of all, we want our tired grant reviewers to be able to read our sentences, our paragraphs with ease. We don't want them to be long, convoluted sentences with polysyllabic words, right? Really complex words that they have to read multiple times to understand what it is that you're trying to say. So we always say, try to aim your writing at a 9th grade level. That's the sweet spot as far as how easily something is to read. That is what journalists do when they're writing for newspaper articles, things like that for the general public. Now, let me say, that is really hard to do, particularly for those of us who work in maybe highly technical fields. I work in the behavioral health field, and so sometimes I have to use the word psychological. Things like that. And so that's okay. So, certainly don't neglect some of those terms that you need to use within your field to show that you are a subject matter expert in order to get down to a 9th grade level, but do the best that you can. And here's the way that you know what your grade level is at. In Microsoft Word, there's something that's called a Flesch-Kincaid test, or it's called readability statistics. And what it does is it rates your text on a US school grade level. So it's going to test the line length. It's also going to calculate it by the number of words per sentence. And it's going to give you a number, a readability statistic number, or what's called a Flesch-Kincaid score. So if it says it's an 8, that means an 8th grader can read it and understand it. If it says it's a 14, that means you have to have some level of college education to read it and understand it. Okay, this is how we can look at it. It's one of the very last things that I do when I'm kind of at the tail end of writing my grant proposals. I go in, I look at my Flesch-Kincaid score. I go, whew, I'm at a 15. I need to do some work on this. And I will go in, first thing, I will find any sentence that is longer than 2 lines long and see if I can turn that into multiple sentences instead of a single sentence. Okay, single, long, convoluted, probably a run-on sentence. Yeah, so that's one way to do it. Another way is to find those really long, what we call polysyllabic words, and try to find words that can be shorter. So instead of using the word utilize, I can put in the word use. They mean exactly the same thing, right? That's how we fix the complexity of our vocabulary. Just to give you some fun thoughts about this, the book with one of the lowest scores to date averages 5.7 words per sentence and 1.02 syllables per word. Can you guess what it is? We've all read it at some point in time in our lives. It is Dr. Seuss's Green Eggs and Ham. Now compare that, I'm going to give you another example, to one that has a little bit higher than a 13 Flesch-Kincaid score, meaning, right, if we're 12th grade in high school, you have to have some level of college education to understand it. That would be the Affordable Care Act. So you have just a little on the levels of extreme, you have some examples of what it means for our Flesch-Kincaid score or readability statistics. And looking at the complexity of our vocabulary, the other tip I can give you is always give it to somebody else to read and say, please point out any sentence that you had to read more than once to understand it. Just highlight it, give it back to me, and I'm going to find a way to improve upon that. Okay, good tip. Let's think about typography. Okay, really just that defined as the style, the appearance of printed matter. Now you should be thinking like, well, what in the world does that have to do with readability? Because we are talking about improving readability. It actually does. It has something to do with that, how easy our eyes pick up on words, how easy we have the ability to comprehend what is written in that printed way. There are two main types of font, okay, what we call serif, and you see the example on the right-hand side of the screen. That contains structural details that adorn the ends of the lines used to make up a letter or a number, and what's called sans serif, or meaning no serifs. And so that's any kind of typeface without those serifs. And again, you can see the example on the right-hand side of your screen. Obviously, many of our RFPs will tell us, they'll say, please only use 12-point font Times New Roman. Then you never even have to think about it. You just use 12-point font Times New Roman. But what if the RFP doesn't specify? Do we just use the one that's maybe our favorite? I mean, the bottom line is, if we're thinking about how we're improving readability, the question is, which one is easier to read? Right? Which one's easier to read? So I've given you some popular fonts in these columns. You have serif fonts on the left. Those are the ones with the spots on each of the words that are each of the letters that helps you to see them. And the popular sans serif fonts. We all have our own favorites. The question is, which is easier to read? Drum roll, please. Yeah, our research is telling us that serif fonts are easier to read. Because of the added strokes, it makes each of those characters more distinctive, and more distinctive letters are easier for the eye to recognize. Okay, if you are questioning this, if you're like, no, but I love Arial font, let me just give you an example of how those serifs can be beneficial. Let's just take Arial as an example. Okay. This is a lowercase l. You can see that it looks like a line that goes straight up and down. But you know what? That line that goes straight up and down is also an uppercase I. So which is it? Is it a lowercase l or is it an uppercase I? Because they look exactly the same. And yes, obviously our grant reviewers are just good readers, right? But if we are talking about improving readability, sometimes it's these simple little things that we can do just to enhance that readability. And it's those simple little things that sometimes get us the grant awards. Okay. Other things that we can do to improve readability is thinking about our headings and our subheadings. There are parts of our applications that we want to stand out on a page. Just like the red tulip in this field of yellow tulips, your eyes are drawn to it, are they not? Absolutely, because it's different. So we can think about how we use things like bold, we use italics, we use underlining. Sometimes I will use a combination of all three of those for information that I want their eyes to be drawn to, right? Obviously, when we are transitioning from one section to another, that's where we put headings, that's where we put subheadings, because we want them to understand how they transition from one section to the other, and we put those headings. we're using the language in the RFP. If it says, give me a need statement, I'm putting a heading, need statement, and it's going to be in bold. And then it's going to say, give me your organizational profile. I'm going to put organizational profile, and it's going to be in bold. Okay, this is how we can help the reviewer to have their eyes drawn to those sections. Definitely, if there is a scoring rubric, because that's how they are scoring it, and we can bold, italics, underline those things that they're immediately going to be drawn to score. Use your bold, use your italics, use your underline. That's going to draw their eyes. But there's other things that we can use, bold, italics, underline, things that we want to draw their eyes. That's going to improve readability. And even more so if our grant reviewers are skimming. And yeah, that happens sometimes when it's, they've worked 12 hours, it's 12 o'clock midnight, and yours is the 12th in the pile, and they're tired and they want to go to sleep. It happens sometimes that they're skimming, that their eyes will immediately gravitate to those words. So we can use it very strategically, right? Here's an example, and you can see I bolded the very last sentence that says this. For example, transition age youth were chosen for this project due to their significant risk factors in the catchment area. In the greater Dayton metropolitan area between 2008 and 2014, 5% of the transition age youth who were either treated in local emergency rooms or released from admission were diagnosed with mental health related condition. This rate nearly doubles for the same population in the catchment area. This is actually a paragraph that I wrote in a previous grant application, and I wanted their eyes to be drawn to that last statement. I wanted them to have a wow, emotional response to that last sentence. Yeah, this rate nearly doubles for the population that we're writing for this particular grant. Okay, so use it strategically. Use it when you want their eyes to be drawn. Other ways that we can improve readability is by adding white space to our paper. Okay, I'm going to give you some examples here, but this is a method that we call chunking. A really easy way for you guys, if you're as old as I am, you will remember Chunk from the Goonies, from the 80s movie, The Goonies. You will remember Chunk. And to this day, whenever I go into my grant proposals and I go, okay, I haven't added enough chunking, I see this beautiful face right here. So think about this. Okay, so here we go. Here are some examples about why it's so important to add white space. And before I give you the example, I just want you to, again, we're thinking about emotional responses of our funders, right? Our grant reviewers. So I don't even want you to read this. I just want you to think about how this makes you feel. You ready for it? Here we go. Oh my gosh, it's so wordy. There's no white space. Anytime I do this training with a live audience, they go, I'm overwhelmed. I'm obstinate. Like, I'm not going to read that. I'm kind of a little angry. I don't want to do that. Yeah, I'm done. I'm done. Right. And those are absolutely not the emotional responses we want from our reviewers. But how about this one? How does this one make you feel? Oh, white space. Again, fresh air on a cool summer morning. White space. So what this does is it makes it feel much less overwhelming because it is chunked into pieces. Readers can say, grant reviewers can say, I can manage this. And sometimes that's not even a conscious thought. It's just, oh yeah, look at this. I can, okay. Paragraph number one, right? It definitely takes up more space. And I know that is difficult in grant proposals that are character limits and word limits and page limits and that sort of thing, but we strive for it. Again, it's one of the very last things that I do before I submit is, did I add enough white space? Can I find ways to use some chunking to add more white space? Okay. That's it, you guys. That is everything about persuasive proposal writing that I just hope that you guys have some wonderful tips and tricks that you can walk away, really tangible things that you can start using like tomorrow. Remember to always think through the eyes of your funders. Remember to always think through the realities, the eyes of your grant reviewers. When you do that, your writing is automatically going to be much more persuasive and persuasion wins you grant dollars. It just does. As always, I always cite my sources for things that I have shared with you today, so you have access to all of those. And I just want to thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you being here. Goodness, and go out and win those grants. That's what it's all about, right? Thank you so much, and have a good rest of your day.
So we're just going to jump right into the Q&A session. Just going to moderate this. Some of the folks have jumped in. I'm going to just jump in. We've had several comments about 990. How do you find other organizations 990s? I know some people have jumped in with some input, but will you talk about how do you do that?
Absolutely. Thank you, Tawana. And you guys, the minute I rewatched that video, I said, I never told them where to get the 990. So I caught it just as you all were putting it in the Q&A bar as well. So yes, and thank you for those of you who did do some responses. So the easiest way is to Google something called either GuideStar or Candid. So there were two organizations that kind of merged, and so it's now called Candid, but because everybody knows GuideStar, if you put in GuideStar, it's going to go directly to that. That is in the public domain. You all have access to it. I will say you can search by foundation. So you can just type in, your local foundation, public or private foundation that you're looking to pull up that IRS 990 form. And it will pull up the ones that they have access to. Now, I will tell you, they're not all recent. So, you might pull up a foundation and the most recent one you find might be from 2019. So just know that there are some limitations to that. But there's still some good learning from that, particularly if you can get the last, 5 years or something like that, and really to see if there are any trends in funding for that particular funder.
Right. Now, 990 PFs are not on there. Is that correct? So if you have a private foundation, you're not going to be able to get
not always. There are other like subscription based where you would have to pay like an annual subscription into it to be able to access things like that. Honestly, I've never paid into it, and I've always done okay with some prospect researching. So
great. And then just so folks know, I mean, I've gone on GuideStar, to look at other, other nonprofits. You do have to set up an account and set up a password, but it's free. So
absolutely.
The biggest challenge is remembering your password. So it truly is free.
Yeah, really easy and easy to navigate.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, here's another one. So besides the funder's website and the Form 990, what are some additional ways to find out about a funder's current funding priorities if they're not open to meeting with you?
Yeah, we just want them all to meet with us, right? But you're absolutely right, particularly when they are not in the midst of a funding cycle. So maybe their funding is on hold for 6 months or something like that. They're not going to entertain a bunch of meetings. Right. So yes, number one, always start with their website. I know you said in addition to, but always start there. For those that have it, they have the ability to do that. The second thing I do is pull up their 990. If I'm still not getting what I need and they won't meet with me or they won't respond to emails, I mean, that's when you have to get creative. So that's when you do things
when you stalk them. Oh, no, I didn't say that.
Yeah, that's when you stalk them. I did not say that to one.
No. Let's erase that from the recording.
No, really, but that's where our professional networks come in. Mm. So, I always tell people if you really want to get good at grant writing, you have to immerse yourself into the profession. So that means becoming a part of professional associations, whether that's the Grant Professional Association, the Association of Fundraising Professionals, or both. I'm a member of both of them, and I actively attend meetings. So I know, goodness, I was going to give you a number, but I don't know, 50, 80 grant professionals in my immediate area. And it is interesting because we become a community of people. You would think it would be competitive. But it's not. It is a community. So oftentimes, because these are now people who are my friends, they will say, Andrea, I just found out about these funding priorities you were asking me about the other day. Let me send you some information. So that's thinking really creatively, right? A second way that I would recommend is if there are other nonprofit organizations that you know of that provide very similar services or services to very similar target populations that you serve, learn about them. So sometimes you can go to their websites, and oftentimes nonprofit websites will list who their funders are. And so you can think, oh, well, we also provide fill in the blank. We also provide after school programming for middle school youth. If that funder would fund them for that service, I wonder if they would fund me for that service. And so you can just glean a little bit more information by really thinking very creatively.
Okay, great. Is it unusual to request a funder scoring rubric? That's
easy for you to say, right?
I know, that's right. Yeah.
No, not unusual at all. In fact, I would recommend you always ask for one. Okay. Oftentimes, if a funder is very actively using one, they may sometimes actually just put it in the RFP. And so you have immediate access to it as you get I'm sorry, I hate using acronyms, the request for proposals, the document that the funder releases when they start their bid process. What's called an RFP. If they use one, oftentimes they will include it in that RFP. But if they don't, just ask them for it. And they may say, we don't use one. That's a very common response. But if they
I'm going to follow up. If you don't get the grant, can you ask to see your graded rubric?
Yes, 100%. And so again, let's talk about different types of funders. Okay. If we are talking about a public funder, a governmental funder, they are subject to the Sunshine Law. So if you put in an official request, in writing with your signature, they have to adhere to that. Some are easier to get than others, but technically they have to adhere to that. Many of them do it immediately just because they want to give you that feedback anyways. Others may not be as open to that. If they are not subject to having to do that, they may or may not do that depending on their capacity to respond to everybody's requests. But great learning lessons that come from that. Definitely, when I do not get an award, that's the very next thing I'm asking for. Give me some feedback.
And you've not gotten, like hesitancy or anything from the grantor on by requesting that then?
Oh, no, it depends on the funder.
Okay.
Yeah, it depends on the funder. And again, think about a federal government funder that had to write 300 rejection letters.
Right.
Versus a very small local funder that maybe had a handful of them, and their capacity to be able to respond is very different. So I also try to be very kind when requesting that one, because I might want to go back to them, and I'm not trying to burn a bridge with the relationship, but I also want to understand the reality. If they're sending out 300 rejection letters and they're getting 300 emails asking for it,
right?
They just, give them a couple weeks, a couple months to respond before continuing to go back and say, hey, knock, knock, I asked for this information. Can you still please send it to me?
Okay.
Yeah.
Here's another one. For many small organizations, there is a financial need to raise funds for operations. So capacity building and investments in infrastructure. If we are to focus on the needs of the funder, how can we do this? Should we just accept this funding has to come from contributions?
But it's such a great question. And I tell you, 9 times out of 10, when I get a signed agreement by a new client, the number one thing they say to me is, we need operational expenses. Mm-hmm. And the number one thing I say back to them is, grants may not be the best place to look for those. So that's not to say that it is 100% impossible. There are absolutely funders out there that will fund operational expenses. They are just hard to find because so many of them very much want their money to go towards direct services, directly to impacting and benefiting people in your communities and creating that improved community situation that they just won't. But that's not saying that they're not out there, but I'm very transparent about that. Every financially viable nonprofit organization needs to have a diversified funding base. Mm-hmm. So not putting all your eggs in the grants basket. So yes, go after grants, but also do your annual giving campaigns, also do your donor solicitations, also do your social media campaigns, and when you have the ability to do and bring in money from all of those other non-restrictive funding sources, you can use them to cover your operational expenses.
Okay.
probably not the answer you wanted.
That's a tough one. And,
Yeah,
sometimes it's just really needed to keep the doors open.
Yeah, understood.
So, okay.
And with that said, Tuan, I'm glad you said that because, oftentimes I will have organizations say to me, we're not going to put anything in for indirects. Because we just want our grant proposal to be as competitive as possible. And I have said to them, this is more probably in the last 5 years than I would have said 15 plus years ago, where that probably was a truer statement. Funders are now acknowledging the fact that it takes you money to run a business.
Right.
And so I've started hearing from funders, I'd say in the last 5 years, that when proposals in their budgets put $0 for indirects, it's almost a red flag. Like, how are you running a business when you're not asking for indirect dollars? We know you have administrative overhead. We know you have operational expenses. Yeah. If it's
as a follow-up on that, what's a reasonable amount for an indirect cost?
That's
a percentage, not as a dollar amount, but percentage, like a range that wouldn't be a major red flag. Obviously, if it were 50%, that would just be, yeah.
Yeah, I always try to stay between 10 and 12%. I think that that's very competitive, but I want to put a clarifier that I live in the Dayton area. I seek funding mostly in the state of Ohio. I do seek for national foundations, but also for programs and organizations in the state of Ohio. If you move to LA, that percentage might be a little bit different.
Okay.
And if you work for, I know universities, I work with a lot of universities, and they have standard 21, 25% that is allowable for some funders because they understand the realities of universities and those indirect rates. As a standard nonprofit, I'd say try to keep it between 10 and 12%.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay. So if a nonprofit is fairly new and the program that they're trying to get funded is still in the development stage, how do they effectively define their credibility?
It's such a good question. It's a hard one. It's a really, really hard one.
Believe us, we don't have any track record, but believe us.
I know, right? And you just want them, because you believe it in your heart of hearts. You just want them to believe it as well and take your word for it. The very first thing when I do start working with very grassroots kind of new nonprofit organizations is before we even get into the grant conversations, we start talking about what are you doing to develop yourself as a sound, viable organization. Okay, so really making sure they're doing all of that background work to have a solid, what we call backroom functions, your human resources policies, your fiscal practices, your administrative practices, your board governance functions, and I equate this to when you build a house, the very first thing you have to build is a really solid foundation. Because everything up, the windows, the walls, the roof is, relying on that solid foundation. It's the same thing within our nonprofit organizations. Those backroom functions, HR, fiscal, administrative, right, board governance, that's your foundation. All your programs and services are relying on that solid foundation. So making sure new nonprofits are doing what they need to do to build that solid foundation. Then you start collecting information that we call credibility statements. So the staff that you're hiring, do they have appropriate qualifications, credentials, licensures, fill in the blank, right, for your particular field? And if they don't, what are you doing to support them in getting those things? Because that's going to add credibility. Same thing with consider whatever your field is, getting an appropriate accreditation or certification for the agency, not for individuals, but for the agency.
Right.
As a new nonprofit, those are painful processes. Those are very, very painful processes. But number one, just know there are consultants out there that can help you through that process. And number two, every time I work with an organization that I help them to become credentialed, the very last thing they say to me at the end of it was, yes, that was painful, but we're so happy we went through it. Because we just added to our credibility. And now we can add that to our grant proposals. We can tell funders we're accredited, that sort of thing, and you're building that credibility at the program level as well. So how are you using best practices, gold standards? How do you prove to a funder that it's a good program?
And how do organizations find out what they're accrediting organizations are in their areas, because I know of specific accreditation agencies for specific types of nonprofit organizations.
Sure. I mean, depending on what you do, we all have our authorities, right? Whether that's the state department for your particular field or a national department or a professional association. We need to get embedded into, that's our field. We need to become subject matter experts. So you get ingrained into those authorities within your particular field, and that's how you're going to learn about all of those things.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is another one. This is, I love this because it's about the fonts again and the bold. But so do online grant applications allow the user to change fonts, use bold, and make other formatting tools? And I'll put in like the chunking. Can you chunk?
It's a great question, because if I were answering this 10 years ago versus today, I would have given you a different answer. So when we first, yes, I have been doing this long enough that I remember actually paper grant proposals and making 10 copies of them and going to Kinko's and then mailing them by UPS in big boxes, right?
Yep.
When we first started moving to these online application portals, it was very much text boxes. So it would say, here's your text box. You have 500 characters.
Right.
And at that point in time, no, the text box, they told you, it mandated what your font was going to be, and it wouldn't allow you to do things like bullets or numbering or italics, things like that. It was just a standard text box. The majority of electronic portals today, I'm not saying that those text box portals aren't still out there. They are. But many of them have evolved more into you're uploading a document into their electronic portal. So yes, since it was a Word document, and you guys know what you can do with Word, you can bullets, you can bold, you can do whatever you want with a Word document, and then you eventually convert that into a PDF and you upload that into an electronic document. So then, yes, you have the ability to do whatever you want with the font.
Okay, super. I think we have time for maybe a couple more. Sure. This person says, since I have never served as a grant reviewer, should I consider getting training to develop a grant reviewer skill set? And if so, how does a person go about getting this training?
Oh, sure. So yes, there absolutely are grant reviewer trainings out there. They're not necessarily helping to give you a skill set on how to be a grant reviewer, but it's how to find opportunities to become a grant reviewer.
Oh, okay.
So here's the truth. So again, every funder is different. Every grant process is different. How every funder goes about choosing their grant reviewers is very different. But the majority of them are going to start with some sort of an application process. They want to know, who are you? What are your qualifications? They're looking for subject matter expertise in whatever the field is, right? So, I'm in behavioral health. So I'm going to submit my application. It's going to have all my behavioral health, credentials in it. It's going to say I've been in the behavioral health field for 27 years. That's what they're really looking for. The hard part, I think, more is finding out how to become a grant reviewer. And that's where I said there are trainings in that. I'm sure there are others, but I am partial to the Grant Professionals Association. I've been a member of them for as long as I can remember. And that's where I've taken several trainings on that. So I would recommend that's where you can look for those kinds of trainings. The last thing I'll say about that, though, is as much as I recommend, if you are a grant writer, that you get some grant reviewer experience, because there's so much learning in this, the one thing you really have to consider is the time commitment. Okay. And many of them will give you that information up front. So they will tell you the process will last from May to August. And they'll say, this is the timeline. You will get a maximum of 24 proposals. You'll get it on this date. You will have 3 weeks to review them. You have to attend a mandatory meeting on this date to discuss it. So they'll give you that timeline, which is really nice, because then, we're all busy people and we have to go back to our calendars and go, okay, the bulk of my work is in, can I review 24 proposals in 3 weeks? Yeah.
And do you seriously think that makes you a better grant writer by being on the other side of the table?
100%. Yes. Okay. Yeah. It's understanding the realities of what does it take to look through this process. And here's the biggest eye opener, because once you've read a handful of them, you will go, okay, I didn't enjoy reading these at all. I loved reading this one.
Okay.
So
Okay.
what was in this one that what wasn't in this one that made my job easy? I'm scoring then tens all across, right? I want to fund that. I want to fund
Right.
them. So how can I learn from that experience? It's going to help me to be a better grant writer.
Right. Well, somebody shared a few minutes ago that they went through the grant review training and review process, and it was so helpful to be on the
nice.
side for them.
Yeah.
I have to admit, I really never have thought about the grant reviewers, as far as their stress and all this adding to, the end of their day. So it puts a different perspective on it.
I'll be very transparent and say it's one of my least favorite things to do in the world.
Okay.
I mean,
but it made you better.
Being a grant reviewer, and mostly because it is such a tedious process. You're on a timeline. You have other priorities that, because we all wear multiple hats, and you want to do your due diligence because you want to be good fiscal stewards of the dollars.
Right.
You always feel pressured for time. So it is a bit exhausting. It is a bit stressful. I know lots of people who have retired from the grant writing business, and they just became grant reviewers because they don't feel that stress and pressure of it anymore. Now they enjoy it. But,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, Andrea, I just want to thank you on behalf of ReadyWare and everyone joining us for your time and putting this presentation together and your expertise and helping out our nonprofits to be better grant writers. We really do appreciate your time. Yeah. And for everyone who's joined us on this little Zoom call, we appreciate your participation as well. We will be getting surveys out to everyone. We really encourage participation because it helps us to know what topics we should hit in the future, what things we need to do better. So it's critiquing our, grant writing or our production of these Take 5 episodes. So I guess I never introduced myself. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Twana Cheek, and I am the director of the nonprofit services here with ReadyWare. We will be having fall sessions, so keep an eye out on your emails, and we will get those on the calendars probably in the late summer. So we want to thank you all for attending. Thank you again, Andrea. We really appreciate it. So thanks, and have a great day.
Thanks so much for having me. Bye, everybody.